Alright, what's going on everyone? In this video I'm going to show you how to upgrade the Dimir Control Challenger deck on a budget. All prices in this video are going to be in US dollars, and I know that isn't relevant to everyone, but the goal is to not spend more than the deck's retail price on the upgrade, so that should give you a rough idea. We're looking to spend $25 to $30 USD. That's what these decks typically sell for. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how much we're spending, even if the currency isn't relevant to you. So there are a couple of important things to note with this deck. First off, Dimir isn't a super popular deck in the metagame. Currently, the two most popular forms of control are Izzet and Orzhov. And then this combined with the fact that control decks are constantly changing to adapt to the metagame means there isn't really like a firmly established deck list that we can just base our upgrades off of. I still have some upgrade suggestions, of course, but I also want to cover some of the ins and outs of this deck and different builds of this deck. So we're going to be showing some upgrades, and then I just want to talk about how you can adjust this deck to your local metagame. So first off, we need to take out the 2 Parasitic Grasp and replace them with 2 Bloodchief's Thirst, which is actually a free upgrade because you have the 2 Bloodchief's Thirst in your sideboard. In fact, you just need to swap them, take Parasitic Grasp out, put Bloodchief's Thirst in, and then take those Parasitic Grasp, put it right back into your sideboard. This is just how the deck is normally played. I'm not entirely sure why they swapped them. Bloodchief's Thirst is just better main board. It's good against aggro decks, but it isn't dead in control decks because you can pay the kicker cost and kill bigger creatures and planeswalkers. And Parasitic Grasp is more narrow. It is really good against aggro decks with humans. White aggro plays a lot of humans. There's the Naya human stack. Really good card against those, being able to kill an aggro threat and also gain life. Super important. It's just narrow because if you're not playing against one of those decks, playing against a control deck, it could just be completely dead and useless. So it's a sideboard card, should be in the sideboard. Bloodchief's Thirst just makes better sense in the main board. Next, I think it's worth it to take out the Graveyard Trespassers for Sedgemoor Witches. The Trespassers were played a little bit around rotation time, but most decks are now playing the Witch. Not only is it difficult to target with Ward, but it makes a bunch of chump blockers for aggro decks, and also those chump blockers gain life when they die, the pest tokens. So this is great at helping stave off an aggro deck, and also gives you a board full of creatures to potentially just kill your opponent after you've stabilized, right? As you're casting removal, as you're casting counter spells, you're making a board which can be thrown in front of blockers if you're under pressure, or can just kill your opponent if you're not, so not bad. So now we need to address one major problem I have with that deck, and that's the amount of creature removal. So your deck is currently running 11 spot removal spells and 6 board sweepers, and this is much more than most other Dimir Control decks that I've seen. Most decks play 4 board sweepers, on the high end maybe a 5th, and most are playing like 6 or 7 spot removal spells. The most spot removal spells I saw in a deck was up to 10, that's the most ever, and it's still less than your deck, right? I assume this is because Wizards of the Coast expected some people to play these challenger decks against each other, and the other 3 decks are creature based, so it kind of makes sense. But the problem is, if you're playing this, in the wild, not against the other decks, then your deck is a little bit too creature removal heavy, and you will kind of flounder against other control decks. You'll have a lot of dead control cards. If you've played this deck against another control deck, I bet you spent a lot of time looking at a bunch of black removal spells in your hand with no targets, right? So we can fix this by taking out a Crippling Fear for a Professor Onyx. So this still gives us the option to remove creatures. We're not actually lowering the creature removal count because the -3 ability can remove creatures, but it has the extra utility of drawing cards and draining life when we cast spells, so it's always relevant. And the -8 ability is also potentially game ending since it starts with 5 loyalty. It's not inconceivable that we could actually hit that. So a much solid choice. It brings our board sweeper count down by 1. We have 5 board sweepers now, which I think is a little bit more reasonable, and a planeswalker is always welcome in a control deck for sure. We can also replace some spot removal spells with the Celestis and Reckoner Bankbuster. So these 2 cards have become incredibly popular in control decks as they both ramp you into board sweepers and top-end threats while also providing card advantage. The Celestis is a mana rock that will let us loot every time the game switches from day to night, and the Bankbuster lets us draw 3 cards over time. We pay to activate it, draw a card, and eventually makes a pilot and a treasure token, so sort of ramp. So both of these are popular and different players have different preferences. Like you'll see one deck with 4 copies of Celestis, and then the next deck will have 4 copies of the Bankbuster. Some people play a 2-2 split. They'll literally play 2 Celestis, 2 Bankbusters, so on and so forth. There's a lot of variety. You can kind of pick and choose whichever one you prefer. I personally prefer Celestis. I like the long game and being able to draw more and more cards, whereas I don't like that the Bankbuster eventually runs out of cards, though it does have the benefit of actually drawing them, whereas the Celestis is just looting. But my personal preference is Celestis, but you can kind of do whatever you want, and I think it's definitely worth taking out 2 power word kills for either one. Technically, my official suggestion, my completed deck list is going to be the Celestis, but either's fine, and we're taking this out because it's the most narrow removal spell. Sometimes we just can't kill stuff with it because it has so many restrictions. A lot of decks do play like a single copy of Power Word Kill, but we have 3, and I think 3 is too many. So we'll go down to get some of these artifacts in. I think that's totally fine. And if you really want the other 2 artifacts, you can probably add them to the deck by taking out Thirst for Discovery. I don't think this is necessary. I'm personally going to keep the Thirst for Discovery in because I like that it's a spell, so it synergizes with Professor Onyx, Sedgemoor Witch, Hullbreaker Whore, right? We want spells, so I actually prefer the spell. But if you really want, 4 Celestis or 4 Bankbusters or 2 of each, Thirst for Discovery is probably what you want to take out, but I don't really think it's 100% necessary. I also want to adjust the sideboard. We need to take out the 2 Mischievous Catgeists for 2 Go Blanks. I don't know what the point of the Spirit is. I guess it's okay against decks with no spot removal, because it can draw cards, I guess. But Go Blank is very typical. You usually see a couple of these in black control deck sideboards because it's a way to exile the graveyard. Also makes the opponent discard a couple cards, so it's pretty decent. Definitely better than this Catgeist that doesn't really do a whole lot. I also think it's worth taking out the Saw It Coming for a Test of Talents. I think the reason the Saw It Coming is in the sideboard is because they knew the deck was overloaded with spot removal, and people would probably want to fix that ratio in game 2 against control decks, but we already addressed that. So now we can use this slot for more niche counter spells that are good against specific decks. This one will counter something and then rip all extra copies out of a person's hand or deck. So it's great against spell heavy decks, especially ones that are looking to cast a very specific card. This deck used to play 3 to 4 copies of this when All Runs Epiphany was in the meta, so being able to counter an All Runs Epiphany and then get all the other ones out was fantastic. Now that it's banned, I don't think it's necessary to run a full 4, but it's still nice to bring in against decks that are looking to cast that one big spell. Being able to counter it and also take all the other ones out of the deck is pretty good. And at this point, I would say we're pretty close to finished in terms of the ratios of the deck. I'm pretty happy with the amount of removal we're playing and the amount of threats and the amount of card draw. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a ton of variation with this deck. So I want to just go over that, give you an idea of what options you have and stuff like that. So first off, we have Leer builds. Leer allows you to recast things from your graveyard by giving all of your spells flashback. This can create massive card advantage swings where you play a Leer and then just recast all your removal, recast all of your card draw. It's really good. However, typically when you play Leer, you want more low cost spells in your deck. That way you can cast multiple spells after you resolve them. So these decks tend to play more Bloodchief's Thirst and Fading Hope. Fading Hope is very popular with this deck. They're just easier to recast. So Leer decks are great. Make sure your mana curve is really low. You want low cost spells in a Leer deck. Also, note that you can't play counter spells when Leer is down. This is why Leer decks used to play Divide by Zero before it was banned. Divide by Zero is a really soft counter spell. It doesn't even counter the spell, it just bounces it to hand, but you could still play it when Leer was on the battlefield, right? You could play it turn 3, play a Leer, then replay it, get that learn twice for card advantage, which is fantastic. So that's why Divide by Zero was played in Leer decks, and also why Leer decks tend to have stuff like Bloodchief's Thirst and Fading Hope. Other notable threats for this deck are Katos, Kato, and Sorin. Because there isn't a firmly established deck list, there's so many finishers that people play. So I just wanted to mention these. They're just all optional, something to consider. If you want to change up your finishers, these are things that other people are playing. Planeswalkers are always useful. Katos has seen a lot of play, like half the blue-black decks play it, half don't. So it's something that people are playing, but that's an option. If you prefer this over, Emrith, that's totally fine. Also, Soul Transfer. This is something that you see a lot. So it can exile a creature or planeswalker, or you can return a creature or planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. And you can do both if you control both an artifact and an enchantment. So we've already talked about the artifacts this deck can play, but you can get the enchantment by playing Meathook Massacre as your board sweeper. It's a board sweeper that sits on the battlefield as an enchantment afterwards, and this allows you to get both effects of Soul Transfer. Sometimes, you don't always get it. In fact, I would say a lot of times you don't, but you have ways in your deck to get both card types on the battlefield, so you can get that extra value sometimes. Unfortunately, Meathook Massacres at the time of this recording are about $50 each, so yeah, a single copy is nearly twice as expensive as the entire Challenger deck, so we didn't go that route, but that's something to be aware of. Soul Transfer is a pretty good removal spell, and it's particularly good when you have Meathook Massacre as one of your board sweepers. Some other notable removal includes Soul Shatter and Invoke Despair. Both of these are perfectly valid, good removal spells, and you can run them if you want. For example, you could replace the final Power Word Kill for a Soul Shatter, and I think that'd be fine. The Power Word Kill is more restrictive in that it could be a dead card, but Soul Shatter, you can't pick the specific creature, so it could hit something that you don't want to hit. Invoke Despair, also really good. It makes your opponent sacrifice many things, although it also is kind of difficult to cast. Those black mana symbols, there's so many of them in the mana cost that it could be a problem. The Celestis does help with that though, so it's pretty good. And both these cards are pretty cheap, so really good removal spells, something to consider. Not necessary. Just, if you happen to open them and you really want to play them, that's fine. Because when you look at Dimir Control decks, the removal package literally is completely different every single deck. Like, you look through all the decks, they're all different. Everybody has different preferences for what types of removal and which counter spells they want to play. And basically anything's fine. You just want to be aware of, like with Soul Transfer, ideally you want Meathook Massacre in that deck. With Leer, ideally you want low cost stuff, right? That's the stuff you want to be aware of. But the difference between playing a Power Word Kill or a Soul Shatter is not that big of a deal, really. But yeah, beyond that, I believe this is our finished deck. I'm pretty happy with this. All we really needed to do was adjust some ratios to make this deck just a little bit more stable in game one. And I think we achieved that. This deck shouldn't feel as kind of clunky against decks that are light on creatures. I definitely encourage you to experiment with different ratios of removal and counter spells. Feel free to adjust it to your local meta. If you're playing against more creature-based decks, you want more spot removal in the main board, and you can play counter spells in the side. If there's more combo decks in the meta, you might want more counter spells main and creature removal in the side, right? You can adjust that stuff based on the types of decks you're playing with. But hopefully this main deck is much more stable as a game one, starting point than what we had out of the box. So there you go, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful. Be sure to check out the other guides if you're interested, and I will see you in the next one.